We've all seen games where shooting has huge advantages, but what if you lost progress by shooting? In Grow, the player must either eat or shoot enemies to kill them and gain mass, while shooting makes them lose mass. This is a screenshot from the prototype that I made. The player will navigate the 2D top-down style map, starting out as a microorganism, progressively growing larger, eating plants, animals, people, buildings, and eventually the entire planet, which is the overall goal of the game. One of the player's main actions is collecting the environment. As you can see from this prototype, the player can only collect objects that are smaller than them. As the player progresses, they will be able to collect larger and larger items as well as kill more powerful enemies. The next main action is shooting. When the player shoots, they lose mass that they have previously gained, so the player must gauge how much they are shooting as to not lose too much progress. Some enemies will chase the player, and larger enemies or bosses will be stationary in order to give the player an option as to when they want to face these larger forces. The player's smaller goals from level to level is similar to the mobile game Tasty Planet. The player will have a time limit in each level to reach a certain size. However, Grow differs from games such as Tasty Planet and Osmos because the player will not only need to reach a certain size, but will also have to kill a very large enemy at the end of every level. There is also much more variation of enemy types. The only way to defeat these enemies is, of course, to grow to a size of equal or greater mass. There are some restrictions to shooting, however. For example, at the beginning of every level, the player is not allowed to shoot as this would reduce their mass smaller than their starting size. The player will then have to focus their first efforts on seeking out objects that are smaller than them to gain enough mass to enable combat. In addition, a negative feedback loop is created throughout the game in terms of enemy difficulty. To start, players will be facing rather small enemies that will chase them. However, the enemies scale along with the player, so they never get to a point where the level is too easy. Some enemies can only be killed in a certain way as well, restricting the player to have to shoot and eat. This is to restrict the player from using a dominant strategy as well as keep gameplay constantly changing and interesting. More powerful enemies will also have a chance to drop power-ups that the player can then use to their advantage, such as speed boosts, damage increases, and several others. If an enemy is much larger than the player, the chance to drop a power-up will be greater. The power-ups will encourage the player to not only focus on collecting passive objects, but to also engage in a risk-reward system where the player faces enemies that are much more powerful than them. So let's take all of these components and present a simple gameplay example. The player travels across the map and approaches an enemy that is much larger than them. The enemy begins to shoot at the player, so they back off and find objects to increase their mass with. Now that the player is of medium size, they have two options as to how to kill this enemy. First, they could spend time gaining mass and fighting off enemies until they are larger than this enemy. At this point, the player can simply approach the large enemy and eat them, thus greatly increasing their size. Another way that the player could approach the situation is to use combat. When the player is of medium size, they can shoot the enemy and lower their health. However, shooting makes them lose size, so the player will want to back off, gain more size, and then go back in for the kill. Either way, the player is being forced to use the core mechanics that the game has to offer. When this large enemy is killed, they may then drop one of several power-ups that will help them through the rest of the level. The biggest risk that faces the game is the environment. The visualization of objects is the main way that the player recognizes progression. The player may start out as tiny particles, but will eventually be eating people, buildings, etc. This environment will allow the player to better recognize where they are in the game and feel much less repetitive. If the game starts its last month of development and the environment still is not adequately represented, we will mitigate this problem by relying more on UI. By showing the player units of measurement, they will be able to better recognize that they have in fact been getting larger. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.